And now, for the last talk, we have Daniele Procida. He asked to change his topic, and knowing Daniele is going to be very interesting. And Daniele has, I think, is the only human being that has been labeled as Python software on a news channel a few years ago. So, a Python software speaking to us.
Go? Good. Sorry about the change of talk. For complicated reasons that I can't really go into now, I was forced to change my plans, so I hope you don't mind too much. I'm Daniele Procida. That's what I look like on television. That's where it says that I am Python software. I work at Devio. We are the sponsors of the speech-to-text transcription service at this conference, so we're really proud of that. So thank you. And Hillary and Cheryl have become such experts, as well as all our technical words. They've learnt a lot of important and common Italian words like "Prisen Colinen Zinain Chusol." See, it really does work. We're hiring. Go and have a look at our website. I've been proudly involved with Django CMS in all my time in Django. I'm a member of the Django core development team and a board member of the Django Software Foundation. You can read my email address and watch me on Twitter, where I don't say anything interesting. So, you should know this picture. This is a landscape with the fall of Icarus. Here's poor Icarus falling unnoticed as the rest of the world goes by. The fall of Icarus is a senseless tragedy, but the story of the fall is deep with meaning. So we can imagine his fall short and full of terror in moments that belong only to him. They have nothing for us. But the story of what happens, the story of the time, the record of the time, carries meaning. It carries, for example, warnings about hubris or foolish pride or not listening to your father, or maybe about how the world carries on when tragedy overtakes you. So I'm interested in what we can learn from this record of the time. I want to start by talking about madness for programmers. So apparently, according to Albert Einstein, madness or insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Actually, maybe it was Rita Mae Brown who said it, or Mark Twain. Or apparently it's an ancient Chinese proverb, but I don't know who said it. But you get the point. You're programmers. I'm sure you recognize this. You've found yourselves doing the same thing again after running into unwanted behavior, running exactly the same code in exactly the same circumstances as if you might get a different result. And there is something mad about this, and it's an experience that we as programmers are very familiar with. So what's going on? What is this madness that afflicts us when we sit there at the controls of our machines doing the same thing again because the results weren't what we expected or wanted, or do it again and watch in disbelief when it crashes again, and then despite the evidence of our eyes, all we can say is, damn it, this can't be happening. On the 31st of May, 2009, Air France Flight 447 from Rio to Paris encountered icing conditions 3 hours after takeoff. And ice crystals began to accumulate in the pitot tubes of the plane that measure pressure, but airspeed, in fact, causing them to give inconsistent readings. And as a result, the autopilot disengaged. Because of the turbulent conditions, Pierre-Cédric Bonin, the pilot flying, had to correct the plane's attitude, and as well as adjusting for roll, he pulled back on the stick, causing the plane to climb and lose airspeed. And within just a minute, the icing event was over, and the instruments were reporting normally. But the plane had climbed to its maximum height, it had lost airspeed and lift, and was starting to stall because it was in an excessive nose-up attitude. The stall alarm sounded in the cockpit, and the aircraft started to fall because it was no longer flying. And the pilots fought the controls down towards the Atlantic Ocean, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. And all the while, Bonin kept pulling back, trying to climb, not realizing that the plane was in a stall. The captain, Marc Dubois, who had been on a rest break, was called back into the cockpit, and he sat behind them. And the stall warning blared out in the cockpit nearly 80 times. At just a few thousand feet above the water, the first officer and the captain finally realized what Bonin was doing, and they put the nose down so the plane could pick up speed and recover. And it was too late. And the airliner smashed into the ocean, and everybody, all 228 people on board, died. And one of the last things heard on the cockpit voice recorder is, "Damn it, we're going to crash. This can't be happening." This incident has a real hold on people's imagination. It has become like a myth, like the story of the Titanic, perhaps, in which we might find some kind of deep truth or meaning or a mystery to be revealed. How can we explain how an Airbus, an A330, came to fall out of the sky, one of the most safe, reliable aircraft in the history of aviation? There was no reason for it to crash. The crew were not incapacitated. The engines were working. The plane was responding to the controls correctly. Apart from that brief sensor error, it functioned normally all the way down to the ocean. And it can make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up just to think about it. Because you think about those people falling out of the sky, because you know it could be you, but also because when you understand what's happening in that story, it sounds like a story of madness. It's like looking into an abyss of irrationality, and that's a hard thing to look at. Does anybody know Laurie Anderson? Laurie Anderson's music? Well, you should, not necessarily before you get on an airplane. In an air crash, there are two times. There is the time, and there is the record of the time. There's the time that belongs to the human world, the time of flesh and blood and fear, the time we're living in right now when things happen. And there's that other time, the time that belongs to something else, to the plane, to the systems, to the world of numbers and data and technology, in which the plane somehow continues to exist after it has been broken into pieces. So there's our time now, lived out, contradictory and confused, and counted down in maybe minutes and seconds, and the time that will be pieced back together afterwards in the investigation and preserved forever by the flight's aircraft, by the flight's data recorders. So we have the time and the record of the time. If our time comes to an end, maybe some shadow of it, some memory of it will be recreated out of the record of the time, just as maybe something of the aircraft will be created out of its own record. But this time, our time will be gone and never recovered. Only the record will remain. So our time unfolds only once and inexorably towards its end. But the record of the time can be played back over and over again, forwards and backwards, and stopped. In our time, Air France Flight 447 is gone, and all those people have gone. But in the record of the time, we can suspend the fall of the plane, the passengers asleep or unaware, and the pilots fighting the controls, the passengers unaware that madness has taken over in the cockpit, that Pierre-Cédric Bonin is pulling up on the stick and expecting a different result. So let's not talk about pilot error or madness anymore, because aviation has got a better term for us. And it is loss of situational awareness. Bonin, Robert and Dubois lost situational awareness. It's what happens when a pilot loses the true picture of their situation. It takes many forms and it unfolds in many ways. And when you lose situational awareness, all the cues you need may be staring you in the face, but because of a contradiction with your expectations, you fail to understand what they are telling you. In aviation, a loss of situational awareness is deadly. It's a kind of cognitive breakdown. It's got a number of notable characteristics, all closely related, and all of which play into each other. Blind spots, faulty mental models, misjudging cause and effect, poor decision making. The question I want to explore is, does the same kind of cognitive breakdown afflict programmers and pilots when they make irrational decisions and judgments? And I think it's worth looking at programmers and programming a little more closely to understand what it is that we're doing. Has this turned off? How about that now? I've gone dead. Okay. I'll shout for a moment. So, what kind of thing is programming anyway? Take this off. Yeah, excuse me, I have to quick change. Stop. Jacopo will negotiate over my missing seconds. Yeah. Okay, how's that? Okay, that's okay. Maybe that's a little bit loud. Let's take that away from there. So, some people think that that programming is a science. Not many people, and they're all wrong. Don't get confused by the existence of computer science, which is concerned with computing and computation, not with programming. Sorry, I'm just fighting my own controls here. And let me attach this to my clothing. Okay. Programming is much more like engineering or flying a plane. Now, some people think that engineering is a science, and they're wrong too. Programming and engineering and piloting are skills, crafts, or arts, what in ancient Greece would be referred to as examples of techne, which is the root of our word technology. In fact, one of the examples of techne that Plato likes to use is of piloting a ship. And we find some very interesting parallels scattered around between the two crafts. For example, pair programming finds its parallel in the two-person cockpit, where we have a pilot flying who operates the controls, and the pilot not flying, or called the pilot monitoring sometimes, who is responsible for managing checklists and communications and confirming things and giving instructions and overall flight operations. And I'm interested in finding some parallels that occur when things go wrong. In nearly all crafts, you find two activities or two phases, parts of the cycle of exercising this craft. And here these also correspond to two activities in the craft of programming. Programming itself, programming proper, and debugging, the creative phase and the troubleshooting phase. In all crafts, the primary activity is synthetic, putting things together. The secondary activity is analytic. It's concerned with assembly on one hand, on disassembly on the other, moving forward or moving backward, for example, from the failure to the root of the failure. When we're creative, we're involved in imaginative, goal-oriented thinking. When we're debugging, we're engaging with logical, problem-oriented thinking. We're asking, how can we get there from here? In one, how did we get here when our program is crashing? We'll think, let's make something happen when we're creating a program, and why isn't it happening when we're debugging? Now, all crafts exemplify this division, but the work of the programmer is a little bit unusual in how much time is spent in this secondary phase and the amount of energy it consumes. So I'm actually interested in this part of programming rather than that part of programming. I'm not interested in the programming activity. I'm interested because that one gets a lot of attention as a discipline, and this one doesn't. As an activity, programming proper has developed methodologies and frameworks and paradigms and theories, and a great deal has been said about its practice and about how teams work and how work can be planned and managed and executed and delivered. And about this, remarkably little. And it's odd, because debugging is so significant to programmers and in programming. Very briefly, here are a few reasons why it's more significant in programming than in other crafts. Programming is a creative craft, like writing. And in creative crafts, it's okay to get things wrong. You don't want your surgeon or your cook to be doing things for the first time. You want them to have done it many times before, successfully. But when somebody's writing a book or a poem or a program, you expect it to be going wrong sometimes and for debugging to be involved. When it comes in programming, failure is unarguable. If you're not sure about how well your writing's working, you can take a break from it, consider it, is this working or not? Your program will tell you that an error has come. You don't get to think, well, actually I think it does work, but we have to understand it in this way. If it crashes, it crashes. Trying again in programming is nearly instantaneous and cost-free, unlike, for example, trying to build a dam. You don't get to try it again for nothing when you're building a dam or a building. Feedback about how well things will work in programming is also nearly instantaneous and cost-free. And finally, debugging is a private affair, like being in a malfunctioning relationship or throwing up. It's a misery that we endure in private. We don't talk about those things. And all these form part of a potentially vicious cycle in which the response of the programmer to an error is to try again. A short cycle with no time to step back or reconsider, and a closed cycle in which the programmer is disinclined to get away from the orbit of the code and the error to talk to someone else. And so here we are, programmers, debugging, finding ourselves doing the same thing again as if we expected a different result, fighting the controls. It's madness. But we found better ways to describe what's going on. So let's stop using that word madness. Let's say that in debugging, we can see an inherent tendency towards cognitive breakdown. I'm arguing that debugging itself, the nature of debugging itself is such that it provokes the loss of situational awareness. I'm arguing that the activity of debugging is responsible for producing the same kind of cognitive breakdown that tore Flight 447 out of the sky. You're trying to restart a web application that crashed. You do the usual things. Half an hour later, you are amending production code on the fly while you're logged into the server. Damn it, this can't be happening. And finally, you discover you've been doing all these futile and desperate things on the wrong server. No wonder they weren't working. You were typing commands into the wrong terminal window. You were desperate for clues, and all the clues were there, and they were staring you in the face, and you did not because you could not see them. You lost situational awareness. Or you're debugging a complex algorithm that was working until yesterday when you made some minor and insignificant changes, and you know your algorithm inside out because you've been living inside it for a month, and now somehow its logic is collapsing around you. So you take it apart, piece by tiny piece, checking it and rechecking it, touching parts of it that you know can't possibly have anything to do with the problem. And by fiddling with it, your own mental model of it starts to break down. And the feeling is one of incomprehension, but also of outrage and anger, as if you've been robbed of something. When I had my bag and passport stolen from a train station, that's exactly how I felt. Like it felt like the damn it can't be happening of a bad debugging experience. And then later you realize that in the minor and insignificant changes that you made, one of them caused your algorithm to receive different data from the data it was expecting. So you dived deep into a debugging rabbit hole, chasing after a completely irrelevant solution to your problem. There was nothing wrong with your algorithm, but you lost situational awareness. And then you fly your plane into the ocean, telling yourself that this can't be happening. Loss of situational awareness, this cognitive breakdown, is the enemy of the pilot and the programmer. When it happens to programmers, it makes us look and feel silly. When it happens to pilots, they die. So unsurprisingly, aviation has developed very effective strategies to mitigate loss of situational awareness, to prevent it in the first place, and to recover it when it starts to falter. And what they do is they target the kinds of cognitive breakdown that characterize loss of situational awareness. I showed you this little list earlier. So, blind spots. Your eye has a blind spot. At the right distance, you can look at these with one eye, these two dots, and you will not see the other. You'll never see the other because it's in your blind spot where the optic nerves exit the eye. Blind spots are deadly. A blind spot doesn't just obscure dots, it obscures its own existence. I think we had at least a couple of talks that alerted us to this in different contexts. If you have a blind spot, you can't even tell that you have a blind spot. We all live with blind spots, and new ones can appear in our perception and cognition at any time. The only way to see past a blind spot is by introducing a new perspective or a different perspective, whether you get that by shifting your own perspective or bringing in the perspective of another observer. Faulty mental models. We rely on our mental models of the world. We need to have them so that we can operate and deal with the world quickly and efficiently. We have to be able to internalize the world outside. It's our own subjective representation of reality. The more complex the world that we're trying to deal with, the more complex our model needs to be. And when our model starts to break down, we need to rebuild it based on the world, based on something from an objective reality that's outside our subjective representation. German has got two words for object, Ding, as in thing, and Gegenstand, meaning something like against stand. Objectivity is what we can stand against, something that's outside ourselves, that is not ourselves, that doesn't necessarily need to be the true, complete, full picture of reality, but just something against which we can recalibrate, remeasure, refine, relocate ourselves, a piece of the world to stand against and rebuild a working mental model. We don't have direct access to causality in the world. We make observations and judgments, and we infer cause and effect. This is a troublesome enough business at the best of times. When we're in complex, stressful situations, it's very easy to make wrong judgments about cause and effect. The flight computers alerted the crew to the stall, but when Bonan pulled back on the stick and the plane's attitude, its angle of attack increased past a certain point, the flight computers were receiving such anomalous data that the stall warning stopped because the computers had no way to process this information. When he let go and allowed the plane's nose to come down again, which was good, the stall warning sounded again because now the computers could make sense of the data they were receiving, so he pulled back to make the stall warning go off. He was trapped in a tight and terrible loop of feedback in which apparent effects were at 180 degrees out of phase with their causes. So rescuing our judgments about cause and effect in the world means pulling them out of these complex, stressful, tight loops by making them clear and explicit so they can be checked and corrected. And finally, poor decision-making. Our decision-making processes need to be exposed and made explicit. Bonan's reasoning, had he spelt it out to the other members of the crew, would have immediately been clearly faulty. And as his panic set in, his actions became more and more irrational. The decisions he took were of poor quality, and they went unchallenged because all the decision-making stayed private, inside his head, where it couldn't be corrected. And the rest of the crew made poor decisions too, decisions that were revealed in their actions and in their words, but never explicitly brought out into the light. Aviation has spent over a century learning how to deal with these problems. Its lessons are woven into every pilot's training. In aviation, cognitive breakdown is addressed through the employment of simple and practical procedures. not through magic or training that gives them superhuman powers. In aviation, everything's on a checklist. It doesn't matter how many times you've followed a certain procedure. Even if you've already done it several times that day, you work your way through a written checklist. Here's a normal checklist for the programming part of flying, the flying part of flying, the synthetic, creative part of flying, getting from here to there, the primary activity. And here are some pages from an A330 quick reference handbook for the secondary activity of flying, the debugging part, emergency procedures. The pilots have these within easy reach all the time. Within a few moments of the autopilot disengaging, the pilot not flying should have had this on his lap, flipping through it to find the checklist for that situation. But instead of falling back to this, Bonan tried to rely only on his memory, his resources, his training, his experience. And he fought the controls instead. And the checklist serves as an alternative perspective. It's something outside you. Your memory and judgments and reasoning may all be faulty, but when you're following a procedure that requires you to check and confirm something, a checklist helps you step outside yourself. We do use checklists a bit in software for things like deployments. Not so much in programming, and I've never seen them used in debugging. Maybe it's time to start. Communication, the act of passing something to another person, usually information or an illness. But in aviation, communication is always explicit and verified. You have the controls, says one pilot. I have the controls, says the other. The pilot not flying says, descending to flight level 350, and the other pilot responds, descending to flight level 350. This addresses all the elements in cognitive breakdown. It brings in another perspective. It gives us what someone else who is not us is doing and thinking. It rebuilds and repairs the mental model. Even the act of describing it to ourselves helps us see any flaws that might be in it. It makes actions and decisions clearer, helping reconnect cause and effect correctly. And it reveals our thinking processes. In this flight, communication was part of the problem, and you can read their communications and you can weep because you can see what's happening. That Robert says, climb, 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 climb. He says, but I've had the stick back the whole time. And they finally realize, too late. No one in the cockpit knew what the others were doing or thinking until it was too late. This is from the Django IRC channel. Someone says, Sai, I spent 3 hours bashing my head against it, and then as soon as I asked the question, I figure it out. Made it explicit, and the problem in the thinking revealed itself to him. Another thing we can do is stop, because stress and panic drive us tighter into our loops of bad decision-making. One thing that aircraft do really well is fly. An airliner in particular wants nothing more than to fly level and in a straight line. Had Bonan simply let go of those controls, the plane might have deviated from the course a little, but that would have been the most significant thing he remembered about his journey. He could have let go and the aircraft would have recovered its attitude, airspeed, and lift. Don't just do something, sit there. It allows a plane to recover, it allows a pilot to recover. A pilot can't do nothing indefinitely, but longer than you think, and programmers probably can do things indefinitely because the computer will be there patiently even if you don't come back until the next day. Often the best thing we can do is get as far away from the code as possible. We're more likely to solve the problem and less likely to do damage. So these are all ways of stepping out of your current failed and failing perspective, finding something else in the universe to get a grip on, to stand against, ways to reset your thinking and prevent bad judgments and decisions. They can work in the same ways in programming or debugging as they do in aviation, and they do work in aviation. The reason that we talk about Flight 447 is not because that happens every day, but because it was a once-in-a-lifetime horror. Flying on an airliner is an outstandingly safe way to travel. Other industries are starting to develop learn some of these lessons from aviation, like surgery, nursing, the nuclear energy industry. Now, programs, we love to talk about programming and about the theory and practice of programming and methodology, but we don't tend to theorize about debugging, especially not when we're debugging. We love talking about debugging once we have vanquished our bugs, even if the joke's on us because we are doing it in the wrong terminal window. But while we're doing it, we never talk about it. I think the idea that debugging is a private misery has to change. In an air crash, as I said, there is the time and there's the record of the time. In aviation, the record of the time is painstakingly built up and scrutinized and replayed endlessly so that it won't be repeated in another tragic loss. And we rarely do this in programming. We don't tend to dwell on our failures or confront them in the same way. And it's strange because as programmers, we spend so much time debugging and pay so little attention to the record of the time of that debugging. Aviators do, and we can learn the lessons from them without having to pay the price that they have had to pay to learn them, and make use of the techniques that serve aviation so well against the common enemy of cognitive breakdown and loss of situational awareness. These are all simple things that you can actually implement and do. So the next time you find yourself thinking, damn it, this can't be happening, just try one. Very last thing. Unfortunately, as individuals, there is only so much we can do. Aviation's approaches are systematic, cultural, and absolutely fundamental. So we can try and do those things, but until our debugging mistakes routinely kill us and our customers, our culture won't change. So the challenge is going to be not to adopt our own ways, but to change a very fundamental thing about the way our own industry faces its own troubleshooting. Thank you very much. Do we have time for any questions or not?
Not really, but we have time for one question.
One very quick question then. Or maybe there are no questions. Oh, here comes
someone. When I was growing up, at least, it was common knowledge that a computer does not what you want, but instead what you tell it to do. But at some point, I was told that between what you tell the computer to do and what actually happens, there's so many levels of interpretation, the programming language, the operating system, all of the software in between, that for all intents and purposes, the computer does exactly what it well then pleases.
Okay.
And that actually makes it sometimes not so insane to just try again, because sometimes you do get different results. In every complex system, sometimes just trying it again and again may teach you things about what's actually happening. So how do you react to it?
We can try it again once maybe, but not all the way down to the ocean, you know, not all the way to SSHing into the live server to start changing your code. So, yeah, but the temptation is so strong. And I think you've actually, in a way, I talked about this, how programmers are tipped into that part of the cycle. And you're justifying it. That's what I think. Yes, I think that you're thinking like a programmer and have to think instead like a pilot. I think that might be it.
Maybe. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I'm happy to talk about this.
Thank you, Daniele.